My name is Mia, I'm 47 years old, and I was married to the same man for over 20 years. One morning, I walked into my own kitchen and found a note that said, "I'm done with you, and I'm taking everything." No warning. No goodbye. Just an empty house and a broken trust. What I did next changed everything. Tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe for more family drama, quiet revenge, and emotional courage stories. I still remember that morning clearly, not because anything loud happened, but because everything felt too quiet. I had just pulled into the driveway, my hands sore from gripping the steering wheel longer than usual. The sun was already up, but the house looked darker than it should have. No porch light. No movement behind the curtains. Even before I unlocked the door, something in my chest tightened, the way it does when bad news arrives before words do. The door opened easily. Too easily. I stepped inside and paused, listening. No television hum. No coffee machine bubbling. No footsteps from a hallway. The air felt flat, almost stale, like the house had been holding its breath. I set my purse down slowly, expecting him to come around the corner at any second. He didn't. I called his name once, softly, more out of habit than hope. Nothing answered back. That's when I noticed the space. The coat rack by the door was missing his jackets. The shoe mat held only my worn flats. I walked farther in, my footsteps echoing in a way they never had before. The living room looked stripped down. The side table was gone. So was the lamp we argued about for years. It felt like someone had erased parts of my life while I was gone, carefully on purpose. I moved toward the kitchen, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he needed space. But explanations don't empty houses. On the refrigerator door, held up by a red magnet shaped like an apple, was a folded piece of lined paper. My name was written on the front in his handwriting.
Neat. Calm.
Almost polite. I unfolded it slowly, already knowing this moment would divide my life into before and after. "I'm done with you," it said. "I'm taking everything. Don't try to stop me." That was it. No apology. No reason. No emotion. Just a statement, like a grocery list or a reminder on the calendar. I read it again, then a third time, waiting for something else to appear between the lines. It didn't. My hands didn't shake. My knees didn't buckle. I just stood there, staring at the paper, feeling like the floor had moved an inch to the left. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one I wiped down every night, and laid the note flat in front of me. For a moment, I felt foolish, like I'd missed something obvious. Like everyone else had known this was coming except me. I thought back to the night before. He'd eaten dinner, asked if the trash had been taken out, watched the news. Nothing unusual. That memory hurt more than the note. I got up and started walking through the house again, slower this time. The bedroom closet was half empty. His side looked like it had never existed. The drawers were bare, the hangers gone. Even the spare change dish on the dresser was missing. In the bathroom, his toothbrush was gone, the medicine cabinet cleared of anything with his name on it. He hadn't rushed. He had planned. I opened the hallway closet and saw empty shelves where important papers used to sit. I checked the desk in the corner of the living room. The filing box was gone. So was the small safe we kept under it.
My heart thumped harder then.
That's when the fear finally caught up to me. Not loud panic. Just a slow, sinking realization that this wasn't just leaving. This was taking. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, like he'd wiped things down before he left. That detail stayed with me. It felt colder than anger. It felt final. The phone rang and I jumped. It was my sister. I almost didn't answer. I didn't know how to say what had happened without hearing it out loud. When I finally picked up, my voice came out steady, surprising both of us.
"He's gone," I said.
He left a note. She asked questions. I answered some. Others I couldn't. I told her I'd call back later. After hanging up, I made myself a cup of coffee, even though my hands felt heavy. The routine helped. Something about holding that mug reminded me I was still here. I sat at the table again, the note between my palms, and thought about all the times he'd joked that everything we had was his. I remembered laughing it off, not wanting to start an argument. That laughter felt distant now, almost careless. I wondered how many quiet warnings I'd ignored just to keep things smooth. Outside, a car drove by. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Life continued like nothing had changed, and that stung more than I expected. Inside those walls, my marriage had just ended, and the world didn't pause for even a second. I stood up and began opening drawers, checking cabinets, not because I expected to find answers, but because I needed to know what was left. What I still had. With every empty space, a strange calm began to settle in. It wasn't relief. It wasn't strength. It was clarity. He believed he had taken everything. That belief sat heavy in the room, almost daring me to accept it. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my purse. Not to reread. Just to keep. Proof of the moment, everything shifted. Then I looked around the kitchen one more time. My kitchen. My house. Still standing. Still quiet. Still mine to stand in. That morning didn't end with tears or screaming. It ended with me standing alone, listening to the refrigerator hum, realizing that whatever came next would start right here, in the space he thought he'd emptied completely. I stood there a moment longer, the refrigerator humming behind me. Then I moved. Not fast. Not frantic. I picked up my purse from the chair and set it on the counter, like I was grounding myself in something solid. The note was inside, folded neatly, pressing against my wallet. I didn't take it out again. I didn't need to. His voice was already filling the house without him being there. He used to say it casually, almost jokingly. "What's yours is mine." He'd grin when he said it, like it was something sweet, something couples said when they were close. Early on, I believed him. I thought it meant partnership. I thought it meant trust. Standing alone in that kitchen, I finally understood what it had always meant to him. I leaned against the counter and let my eyes drift across the room. The same kitchen where we'd stood shoulder to shoulder making dinner, bumping hips, sharing quiet moments. Somewhere along the way, those moments had shifted. I didn't see it then, but now the memories lined up too neatly to ignore. When we first married, he handled most of the money. I didn't argue. He was confident, organized, always talking about plans. I worked too, of course, but he insisted it was easier if one of us kept track. "We're a team," he'd say. "No secrets." And for a long time, I believed that meant fairness. The first time I felt uneasy was small. Almost nothing. I'd mentioned opening a separate account, just for household emergencies. He laughed. Not cruelly, but dismissively. "Why would you need that?" he asked. "We share everything." I remember feeling embarrassed, like I'd suggested something selfish. I let it go. I told myself marriage meant compromise. Little moments like that added up quietly. When my mother passed and left me a modest inheritance, he was the first to say, "We'll put it toward the house." "Not you. We." I nodded because it sounded reasonable. Because he made it sound like the right thing to do. I didn't realize how quickly we always became him. He had opinions about everything. How much I spent on groceries. Which repairs mattered. What was necessary and what was wasteful. None of it was explosive. That's what made it hard to see. Control doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just narrows your choices until you stop noticing they're gone. I moved into the living room and sat on the bare couch frame he'd left behind, the springs creaking softly under my weight. I remembered the night we argued about that couch. I wanted to replace it. He said it still worked. When I pushed, he reminded me how much he paid for it. Not we. He. I'd backed down again. There was a pattern there. I saw it now. Every time something involved ownership, he positioned himself at the center. Even things tied to me. My car. My work schedule. My time. He never asked outright. He assumed. And when I hesitated, he'd sigh, like I was being difficult over nothing. Friends noticed before I did. One of them once pulled me aside and said gently, "He talks over you a lot." I laughed it off. I said that was just how he was. I said I didn't mind. The truth was, I'd learned it was easier not to mind. I walked down the hallway, and stopped outside the bedroom. The door was open, the room hollowed out. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The memories followed me anyway. Him standing in front of the closet, telling me which side was his. Him deciding what stayed and what went during every rearrangement. Him joking that the house would fall apart without him managing it. He loved that idea. That he was the foundation. The one holding everything together. He said it so often, I think he started believing it himself. Maybe that's why he felt so sure leaving that note. Maybe he truly thought that by walking out, he could take the ground out from under me. I went back to the kitchen and opened a drawer, just to have something to do. It held mismatched utensils, the ones he never bothered to organize because they weren't important. I smiled despite myself. There were so many things he didn't consider worth his attention. So many details he ignored because he assumed control meant he didn't need to look closely. That confidence had been part of his charm at first. He was decisive.
He spoke with certainty.
When problems came up, he didn't hesitate. I mistook that for strength. I didn't see how much it depended on me staying quiet, staying agreeable, staying in the background. I remembered a conversation from years ago, sitting at this same table. I'd asked what would happen if something ever went wrong between us. He waved his hand like it was an annoying thought. "You worry too much," he said. "I take care of things." At the time, that comforted me. Now, it sounded like a warning I hadn't understood. The house felt different as I moved through it again, not empty exactly, but honest. Without his voice filling every corner, my own thoughts sounded clearer, louder. I realized how often I'd adjusted myself to avoid tension, how many decisions I'd deferred, how easily I'd let his confidence override my instincts. There were moments I could pinpoint now. Times I'd signed papers without reading every line because he was impatient. Times I'd trusted his word instead of asking questions. Not because I was careless, but because I wanted peace. Because I wanted to believe partnership didn't require constant defense. I sat back down at the table and rested my hands flat on the surface. The wood was scratched, worn from years of use. We'd bought that table together at a small store outside town. He liked to tell people he picked it out. I never corrected him. That seemed unimportant then. It didn't now. What struck me most wasn't anger. It was clarity. His note hadn't created this story. It had simply revealed it. All those years of what's yours is mine had led to one final assumption. That he could decide the ending without my consent. I thought about how calm his handwriting had been. No rush. No mess. He believed he was in control even as he left. That belief had given him confidence. It had also blinded him. He never doubted his understanding of our life. He never questioned his version of ownership. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Neighbors going about their morning. Normal life continuing. I wondered how many times I'd smiled and nodded while carrying doubts no one else saw. How many times I'd convinced myself that being flexible was the same as being respected. I wasn't blameless. I knew that. I had chosen comfort over confrontation. I had let small things slide until they became habits. But standing there now, I understood something important. Trust isn't proven by taking everything. It's proven by knowing where the lines are and choosing not to cross them. He had crossed them without even seeing them. That was his mistake. Not leaving. Not the note. But believing that because he said what's yours is mine, it had ever truly been that simple. I took a slow breath and let it out. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty in the same way. It felt open, like a space waiting to be filled with something different, something honest. Whatever came next would grow from this truth, rooted in everything he'd assumed and everything I'd finally understood. I took another slow breath and let it out. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty in the same way. It felt open, like a space waiting to be filled with something different, something honest. I stayed by the window for a moment, then turned back toward the kitchen, drawn there by the simple need to do something steady with my hands. I opened the small drawer beside the stove, the one he never used. Inside were folded papers, a pen that still worked, and a thin folder I kept tucked out of sight. I hadn't planned this moment. I hadn't rehearsed it. Yet as I pulled the folder free, my hands felt sure, almost calm, as if they remembered a path my mind had avoided for years. He never asked about that drawer. He never asked about the folder. He never asked why I kept copies of things instead of trusting the single originals he preferred. When I did it, it wasn't defiance. It was habit, learned early in life, taught by a mother who believed in backups and quiet preparation.
He used to tease me for it.
I smiled and kept doing it anyway. I carried the folder to the table and sat down. The paper edges were soft from being handled, though not often. I opened it carefully, like I was greeting an old friend. Inside were documents I'd signed years ago, guided by advice given in plain language by someone who spoke slowly and asked questions my husband never did. That meeting came back to me now. The office had smelled like coffee and old books. The woman across the desk looked me in the eye and said, "Tell me what you want protected." No one had ever asked me that before. I remember hesitating, then answering honestly.
Not boldly.
Not dramatically.
Just honestly.
I hadn't told my husband about that visit in detail. Not because I was hiding something, but because he showed no interest. When I mentioned it, he waved it off. "You worry too much," he said. "I've got it covered." He always had it covered, until he didn't. I flipped through the pages slowly. Each one reminded me of a choice made without applause, without argument. Choices that felt small at the time. Sensible. Almost boring. The kind of decisions no one brags about. The kind that only matter when things fall apart. The phone buzzed on the counter. A message from a neighbor asking if everything was okay. I typed back a simple answer.
Yes.
Just a quiet morning. It wasn't a lie. Quiet can hold a lot. I stood and walked to the hallway, opening the cabinet where we kept household manuals. He'd taken the fancy binder, the one with labels and tabs. What he left were the thin envelopes taped neatly inside the door. Utility information. Insurance numbers. Notes written in my handwriting. He never noticed them. He never needed to. Until now. As I looked through them, a memory surfaced of him rolling his eyes while I taped those envelopes in place. "You and your systems," he'd said. "I can find anything online." I nodded and kept taping. There was comfort in knowing where things lived. I returned to the table and spread the papers out, not to plan anything, but to remind myself of facts. Facts are grounding. They don't shift with mood. They don't argue. They simply exist. He had lived on assumptions. I had lived on details. Another memory came, quieter this time. A conversation with a clerk years ago who asked me to double-check a name. I'd paused, asked a question, signed carefully. That pause mattered. It created a line he never crossed because he never saw it. The kettle on the stove clicked as it cooled, a small sound that made me jump. I hadn't even realized I'd turned it on earlier. I poured the water into a mug and sat back down, letting the warmth settle into my hands. The simple act steadied me again. He never checked the fine print. He trusted his confidence to carry him. When papers arrived in the mail, he skimmed them or handed them to me with a joke. "You're better at this stuff," he'd say, without irony. He thought that meant it belonged to him, anyway. I remembered a time he missed a deadline and blamed the notice for being unclear. I fixed it quietly. Another time he signed something late and shrugged. I followed up. These weren't heroic acts. They were ordinary. They were invisible. They added up. I gathered the papers back into the folder and closed it. The weight felt reassuring, not heavy. I placed it back in the drawer and slid it shut. There was no rush to act. Understanding came first. The doorbell rang. I froze, then breathed again. It was just a delivery left on the step. I watched through the window until the truck pulled away. Even in that small moment, I felt a shift. Fear was loosening its grip, replaced by awareness. I walked through the house once more, this time with different eyes. I noticed what remained because it had never mattered to him. The calendar with my notes. The framed photo he never liked. The plant he forgot to water. These things felt like anchors now. Back at the table, I took out a notebook and wrote a short list. Not a plan. Just reminders. Phone numbers. Appointments to confirm.
Questions to ask.
The act of writing made the future feel manageable, not overwhelming. A knock sounded again, this time for my sister, who must have worried. We hugged briefly. I didn't show her the folder. I didn't explain everything. I simply said, "I'm okay." And for the first time that day, it felt true. After she left, I cleaned the kitchen slowly. I wiped the counter, rinsed the mug, folded the towel. Each movement felt intentional. I wasn't erasing him. I was making space for myself. As afternoon light shifted across the floor, I realized how much he had relied on not knowing, on never asking, on assuming that control meant certainty. He never imagined a world where my quiet habits mattered. I sat down one last time and listened to the house. The hum, the creak, the ordinary sounds of a place lived in. He believed knowledge was loud. He believed power announced itself. He was wrong. What he never asked, never checked, and never knew wasn't hidden. It was simply there, waiting for the moment when calm preparation would matter more than confidence ever did. I stayed seated as the afternoon deepened, letting time pass without forcing it. There was relief in not performing, not explaining, not smoothing anyone else's feelings. I thought about how often I'd filled silence for him, how often I'd translated his impatience into excuses. Now the silence belonged to me. It held my thoughts without judgment. I picked up the pen again and wrote a few lines about what mattered to me, not what needed approval.
Health.
Stability. Quiet mornings. Familiar rooms. I underlined nothing. I didn't dramatize it. I simply acknowledged it. The list felt modest, and that was the point. Outside, a breeze moved the branches, and the light shifted again. I felt steadier with each small observation. He had lived certain that certainty was enough. I lived knowing that care, attention, and follow-through create a different kind of strength. One that doesn't need permission. One that doesn't announce itself. One that waits patiently until it's needed. I closed the notebook, stood up, and felt my feet on the floor, grounded by choices made long ago, steady and present right now. I was sitting at the table, notebook closed, my hands resting over each other, when I first heard it. Not a shout, not a crash, just the faintest sound of a car slowing in the driveway. I didn't move at first. The house was quiet, the light shifting through the blinds in lazy streams. Then came the knock, sharp, impatient, the kind that didn't ask for entrance, the kind that demanded it. I walked toward the door slowly, letting the creak of the floorboards announce my approach. Peering through the peephole, my heart skipped a beat. It was him, standing there with a half-packed briefcase, a coat that looked crumpled, hair slightly tousled as if he had rushed. Confidence still tried to cling to him, but it faltered under the weight of realization. I opened the door, keeping my voice calm. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the door frame, then the empty porch, then back to me. I saw it, the tiny twitch of panic around the edges of his mouth, the way his hands curled over the briefcase handle. That was his armor cracking. All the certainty he'd carried out of the house just days before was trembling, thin and exposed. He stopped, swallowed, then tried to force a casual tone. "I just thought I'd check in. See what's going on." I raised an eyebrow. "Check in? After leaving a note saying you were taking everything." My voice was steady, even friendly, but it held the weight of every small preparation he'd ignored over the years. He shifted his weight, finally setting the briefcase down as if it were heavier than it should have been. Maybe I overreacted," he said. He laughed nervously. It wasn't a laugh I recognized. The man who used to command every room with a grin and a joke sounded uncertain, like a teenager caught in someone else's rules. I stepped aside and let him in, silently noting the careful order in the living room. Every object left untouched, every paper in place. The folders I'd mentioned years ago were neatly stacked, almost beckoning. I wondered briefly if he noticed them, or if he even knew what they represented. He finally spoke, the words spilling faster now, unpolished. "I thought I knew everything about this house, about our life, about us. But I can't find what I expected." His hands fluttered. He wanted control, but it wasn't there. Not in the way he thought it was. I sat back down at the table, fingers entwined. You assumed. That's the problem. He blinked, then laughed again, short, sharp, desperate. Assumed? I've built this life. I've worked for this. How could you? I let that hang. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because he needed to feel the tension. For once, he wasn't dictating the terms. He wasn't the one controlling the room. The panic in his chest was tangible. I could see it ripple in the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers drummed against the briefcase. He started pacing the living room, muttering under his breath, eyes scanning, as if searching for invisible papers, hidden keys, something, anything, that would give him leverage. The more he moved, the more I noticed how much of his confidence was built on ignorance. Every assumption he made, every shortcut he'd taken over the years, left a gap he didn't see until that moment. I stood and poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to him. His fingers trembled slightly as he accepted it. He didn't know whether to sit or keep pacing, so he finally settled in the chair across from me, hunched over like the world was pressing down on him. He started, then stopped, swallowed again. I didn't think. You never asked, I said gently, almost kindly. You never checked. You never knew. His gaze dropped to the glass in his hands, watching it catch the light. I thought I had it all figured out. The house. The money. Everything. I assumed. I nodded slowly. Assumptions aren't facts. You never checked what mattered to me, what I'd done quietly over the years, the things you thought you controlled. That's why you're here like this. I could see it in him. His hands shook just a fraction, shoulders slackening, the bravado of a lifetime melting. He had always believed knowledge was loud and visible, proof of authority. But what I'd built quietly, the careful records, the backup plans, the preparation, wasn't visible in the way he expected. It was invisible, understated, unassuming. Yet it held everything. The phone rang, cutting through the tension. I ignored it. He glanced at it, hesitation flickering across his face. He wanted answers, but not from someone else. Only from me. I didn't give them. He leaned back in the chair, running a hand through his hair. I thought I could just, he trailed off. Panic was leaving his voice now, replaced by disbelief. I don't understand. I don't, how? I allowed myself a small smile, calm and measured. You assumed you owned everything. But some things can't be owned by assumption. Some things need attention.
Care.
Observation. He stared, swallowing hard. His confidence, the one that had carried him through decades of arguments, of decisions, of declarations, faltered in the face of quiet truth. He couldn't command it. He couldn't intimidate it. And for the first time, he realized how much of his life had relied on my silence, my willingness to defer, to accommodate, to overlook. Wait, he said, finally, voice cracking just slightly. Are you saying that I can't? You can't take what you never saw, I said softly.
You didn't ask.
You didn't check. You never knew. The room grew heavier in a strange way. It wasn't anger. It wasn't accusation. It was the weight of reality settling in, unflinching and undeniable. He shifted in the chair, running both hands through his hair now, pacing a little before stopping abruptly. I could see him calculating, thinking through every assumption he'd made over the years. Each one crumbling under the simplest truths, folders, drawers, notes, small habits that had always existed but had never registered in his mind. He started muttering again, words jumbled, trying to piece together where he had gone wrong. I watched, letting him unravel. There was a lesson here for both of us, and this was the first time he had to face it directly. Do you realize, he said finally, I thought this was all mine? That everything, all of it. His voice trailed into a whisper. Yes, I said. You thought that. And now you see that it isn't so simple. It never was. The disbelief on his face was almost physical. He stood abruptly, pacing again, moving faster, as though speed could fix the logic of reality. I stayed seated, hands resting on the table, watching him confront something he had never prepared for, the consequences of overconfidence. It wasn't just the house. It was the realization that control isn't given by tone, by demands, by bold statements. Control comes from understanding, from paying attention, from seeing what others do quietly. All those things he had ignored were now asserting themselves in ways he couldn't stop. He ran a hand over the back of the couch, the cushions he hadn't noticed missing, the furniture he thought he could claim. Each detail chipped away at the fortress of certainty he had built around himself. Finally, he slumped into the couch, exhausted. He was sweating slightly, not from heat, but from the sudden collapse of every assumption he had relied on for decades. He looked at me, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw him vulnerable in a way I hadn't imagined possible. Not angry, not demanding, vulnerable, afraid,
Confused.
I spoke softly, letting the quiet fill the room. This isn't about revenge. It's about truth. You assumed confidence could replace understanding. It can't. He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through him. The briefcase sat on the floor, forgotten. His hands rested limply on his knees. His breathing was uneven, shaky. I realized that this was the moment the arrogance finally left him. It didn't matter what words I said, what doors I opened or closed. The quiet preparation, the things he had ignored, had already done their work. He spoke again, barely audible. I never realized. You never asked, I repeated, watching the slow sinking of his certainty. You never checked. You never knew. And that's why this is happening. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The sunlight shifted across the floor. The air held a tension that was quiet but intense, a reflection of everything he thought he owned unraveling before him. His confidence was gone. Panic had taken its place, but it wasn't chaotic or explosive. It was still, patient, heavy. Finally, he whispered, I don't know what to do. I leaned back, letting that land. Then start by realizing you never had control in the way you thought. You assumed. That's the difference. He sat in silence, staring at the table, staring at the folder I had returned to its drawer earlier, the folder that held every detail he never asked about. Slowly, a tear rolled down his cheek. Not from anger, not from humiliation, but from recognition. Recognition that all along, he had been blind to what truly mattered. And in that moment, I understood something profound. His panic wasn't about losing possessions or status. It was about discovering, too late, that confidence without understanding is fragile. That certainty built on assumption can crumble in the face of quiet truths. I didn't move closer. I didn't offer comfort or explanation. I simply sat, letting the weight of reality settle on him, as it should. Sometimes lessons arrive too late, and the only way they are learned is through the slow, unavoidable process of reckoning. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. He barely spoke, moving in small gestures, touching things as if confirming their existence. I watched him carefully, noting every flicker of panic, every pause, every glance toward the folders and drawers he had once ignored. His confidence was gone. The man who believed he could command the world by force of will alone had learned, finally, what happens when assumptions collide with reality. And I stayed still, grounded, aware that this day, this quiet moment of reckoning, was as much about him discovering the truth as it was about me seeing the full weight of years lived in silent preparation, patience, and care. The sunlight had shifted again when I finally let myself breathe fully. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, noticing the quiet hum of appliances, the subtle creaks of the floorboards, the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering in corners. This was my space now, not because anyone had left, not because anyone had failed, but because I had been here all along, steady, patient, quietly claiming every inch through awareness and care. I started in the kitchen, where the day had begun in shock and disbelief. The countertops gleamed softly in the morning light, the utensils neatly tucked away. I ran my fingers over the worn edges of the table, the scratches and dents telling the story of meals shared, plans made, and life lived. For years, I had accommodated, deferred, and watched. Now, I stood fully aware of what I had quietly held together, what I had maintained without acknowledgement, what he had assumed he could overwrite. I opened the drawers, the cabinets, checking that everything was as I had left it. Not to reclaim something he had taken, he had left what mattered, but to confirm for myself that I was still capable. That my life, my home, was intact. The folders, the small documents, the backups I had made in silence were all here. Each one was a reminder that preparation matters more than bluster, that patience builds strength no one can see until it is tested. As I moved into the living room, the bare spots he had left felt different now. Empty, yes, but not abandoned. The spaces between furniture and objects had become breathing room. I realized I could rearrange, reorganize, and make choices for myself without deferring to someone else's assumptions or authority. I could decide what mattered, what stayed, and what moved forward. The weight of years of subtle accommodation lifted slightly from my shoulders. I sank into the couch, letting my hands rest in my lap, and thought about how this moment had come to be. It wasn't a victory born from shouting or revenge. It was quiet, patient, earned through consistency, through attention, through noticing what others didn't. He had believed control meant possession, loud words, and decisions made without consultation. But control was never his to claim, because he had never truly understood the life we shared. And now it was mine to inhabit fully. I remembered all the little signs he had ignored. My careful organization, the notes, the reminders tucked in drawers, the records I had kept. Each one had felt mundane, ordinary, unremarkable until now. In their quietness, they had protected me, prepared me, and ensured that when his assumptions collided with reality, I stood unshaken. I walked through the hallway, running my hand over the walls, touching the frames that held photographs of family gatherings, quiet moments with friends, vacations we had taken together. Each picture told a story, not of possessions, but of life. He had assumed ownership could erase them. He was wrong. They remained, woven into the fabric of the home I had cared for all along. The bedroom was next. I opened the closet slowly, taking in the space he had assumed was his to empty. There were still shelves filled with items I had bought for myself, carefully maintained. Clothes, books, personal mementos, all untouched, all mine. The simplicity of it, the reality of what I had quietly protected, settled in me like a calm tide. I realized that freedom wasn't about confrontation or loud declarations. It was about presence, awareness, and the quiet knowledge that my life could stand on its own. I sat on the bed, letting the sheets shift under my hands, feeling their familiar texture. This room had always been mine, but now it felt more so, more secure, more present. He had walked away thinking he had taken everything, yet the truth was that what mattered most, my awareness, my preparation, my choices, had never been his to claim. He had been confident in false ownership. I was confident in reality. I thought about the day's earlier events, about the subtle shifts in his demeanor, about the cracks in his certainty. Panic had replaced arrogance in ways that were almost poetic in their justice. Not loud, not cruel, not malicious, just inevitable. I had done nothing dramatic, nothing outwardly confrontational. I had only stood steady, allowed truth and preparation to exist, and watched as assumptions fell apart. The house felt alive in a new way. Each corner, each piece of furniture, each quiet space carried a sense of possibility. I could breathe in the freedom, not as a reaction to his departure, but as an acknowledgement of the life I had quietly maintained. The power of presence, the strength of care, the quiet victories over assumptions, all of it culminated in this simple, profound moment. I moved to the window and looked out at the street. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware of the small drama that had unfolded within these walls. Life continued, ordinary and indifferent. And yet, inside, everything had changed. Not because the world had shifted, but because I had finally recognized my own strength. Because I had finally stood fully in my own home, my own life, unafraid and undeterred. I returned to the table and took out my notebook, writing a few lines. Not plans, not strategies, just acknowledgments. A reminder that the quiet attention to detail, the careful decisions, and the patience I had exercised were my own. I wrote about small victories, remembering deadlines, keeping records, caring for the home, maintaining relationships. I underlined nothing, emphasized nothing. It was simply a record of self, of presence, of awareness. After writing, I stood and moved through the house once more. I opened drawers, adjusted cushions, straightened a few items, not for him, not for anyone else, but for me. Each action was deliberate, mindful. Each movement a small assertion of autonomy, a quiet statement that the life here was mine to shape and inhabit. The sun shifted again, casting long beams across the floorboards. I felt a subtle warmth on my shoulders, the kind that comes from being fully present in a space you have cultivated, a life you have maintained. I thought about the years of small compromises, the moments of silent observation, the patient efforts that had gone unnoticed. They had prepared me for this day. They had ensured that even in his absence, I remained whole. I moved to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, savoring the warmth in my hands. I sat back at the table, watching the steam rise, thinking about the simplicity of life when one finally claims it fully. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't noisy. It wasn't flashy. It was steady, secure.
True.
For the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile, small and genuine. Not at him, not at what had happened, but at the quiet resilience I had discovered in myself. Freedom wasn't a moment of chaos. It was a series of small, careful choices sustained over years, culminating in awareness and calm. That realization brought a deep sense of satisfaction, one that no argument or confrontation could provide. I moved through the living room again, pausing to touch the back of the couch, run a hand over the windowsill, and adjust a few picture frames. Each gesture was a small claim, not of ownership over possessions, but of ownership over my own life, my own decisions, my own awareness. I realized how powerful that could be, how freeing. The house had always been mine, but now it felt undeniably so. The quiet, the care, the attention I had given over years had created a foundation stronger than his assumptions. His confidence had faltered because it was built on sand. Mine was steady because it was built on presence. As the afternoon light waned, I sat by the window and watched shadows stretch across the floors. The quiet was profound, unbroken, and full of possibility. I felt no anger, no need for revenge. I simply felt the satisfaction of truth. His assumptions had failed. My preparation had endured. My life continued, intact, full, and mine. I closed my eyes and let the day settle around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft creaks of the floor, the faint scent of cleaned surfaces, they all reminded me of one thing. I had been here all along. I had maintained, observed, cared, and prepared. And now, finally, I stood fully in that presence, free from assumption, free from manipulation, free to exist on my own terms. This house, my home, was a reflection of all that quiet patience, all that careful observation, all the invisible work that had accumulated over years. And for the first time, I allowed myself to savor it fully, deeply, without fear, without apology, and without the need for anyone else to acknowledge it. I poured another cup of tea, sat back, and let myself enjoy the moment. Freedom wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediate. It was steady, quiet, and absolute. I was here. I was whole. And I was finally undeniably free.